You won't want to miss this. Before we jump in, hit subscribe, like this video, and drop a comment. Trust me, you'll be glad you did. The ancient climate regulator in Orenvek's remote cabin groaned in protest, barely pushing back against the relentless blizzard outside. He twisted the dial once more, hoping to coax some warmth from the struggling machine. But the system was ancient, its complaints sounding like the dying breaths of an old starship reactor. Work remotely, they said, Oren muttered, shivering as he wrapped himself in another thermal blanket. No commute, no problem. His laptop screen flickered, struggling against the unreliable power grid. Lines of unfinished security code stared back at him, taunting him with errors. Debugging software in a freezing cabin during the worst storm of the decade wasn't the digital nomad paradise his employer had promised. A deep, thunderous boom split the night. Oren sat up sharply, nearly knocking his laptop off the couch. That wasn't thunder. It sounded heavier, as if something had struck the ground nearby. He hesitated, listening intently. The howling wind made it difficult to discern anything else. Maybe a fallen tree? A collapsing shed? Another sound followed, a pounding at his front door. Oren tensed. No one should be outside. The emergency network had been broadcasting storm warnings all day, urging residents to stay indoors. Even the nearest town was practically shut down. No deliveries, no visitors. The pounding intensified, more urgent this time. Oren hesitated for only a second before throwing aside his blanket and hurrying to the door, his mind racing through possibilities. Maybe a stranded driver? A hiker who got lost? The storm was brutal. Whoever was out there wouldn't last long. Bracing against the cold, he unlatched the door and swung it open, and took a step back. The figure on his doorstep wasn't human. Her skin, a deep shade of iridescent cerulean, shimmered faintly under the stormlight, intricate patterns of glowing veins running along her exposed arms. Her hair, dark and streaked with silver, whipped wildly in the wind, framing a face that was both alien and strangely expressive. Sharp cheekbones, a defined jawline, and a pair of golden, slit-pupiled eyes that burned with something raw. But what struck Oren more than anything was the look of desperation in them. "Cold," she gasped, her voice thick with an accent unlike anything he had ever heard. "Please." She stumbled forward, and Oren instinctively caught her. The moment their skin touched, a deep, unnatural chill shot through his bones. She was freezing, but not in the way a human would be. It was more than just low body temperature. It was as if her very physiology wasn't meant for this environment. Every instinct in Oren's mind screamed at him to be cautious. But something else, something deeper, made him act. "Get inside," he said, shifting to help her through the doorway. She obeyed without hesitation, staggering as the warmth of the cabin enveloped her. The moment the door shut behind her, she collapsed to her knees. Oren quickly assessed her condition. Her body trembled uncontrollably, violent shudders racking her frame. Her breathing was labored, sharp and uneven. He had seen hypothermia before, but this was different. Her kind, whatever species she was, didn't react to the cold the way humans did. "You need heat," he muttered, already moving toward the climate regulator, cranking the dial up to its max setting. The machine groaned in protest, barely putting out anything beyond a weak, reluctant warmth. "Damn it." Oren turned back to her. She was watching him, still shivering, her golden eyes filled with something bordering on desperation. "Not enough," she managed through chattering teeth. Oren grabbed the thickest thermal blanket he owned and wrapped it around her shoulders. She flinched at first, her muscles tense, but then allowed it, gripping the fabric tightly. "I don't know how your kind handles cold," he admitted, kneeling beside her. "But you're going to need more than just a blanket." She shook her head violently. "Heat transfer. Direct." Oren blinked. "What?" She squeezed her eyes shut, as if frustrated that her mind was struggling to form coherent sentences in her condition. When she opened them again, there was nothing but urgency in her gaze. "Body heat," she said. "Skin contact, only solution." Oren felt his stomach tighten. That's not really how we do things on Earth." Her fingers clenched around the blanket, her sharp nails digging into the fabric. My people, not built for cold. Temperature dropped this severe, cellular failure. She swallowed hard, her voice cracking. I will die. Oren hesitated. Everything about this situation was insane. But she wasn't lying. He could see it in the way she was struggling to stay conscious. All right, he relented. But I'm keeping my clothes on. She exhaled in relief. Whether at his compliance or the simple act of breathing in a warmer space, he wasn't sure. Oren helped her to her feet, guiding her toward the couch where the heat from the climate regulator was at its strongest. She stumbled once, gripping his arm tightly for support. Even through his layers, he could feel the unnatural chill radiating from her skin. The moment he sat down, she wasted no time. Ignoring whatever reservations he might have had, she pressed herself against him, wrapping her arms around his torso and burying her face against his shoulder. Her body was shockingly cold, and for a split second, Oren almost recoiled. But then, slowly, he felt it. The trembling in her body began to ease. Her breathing stabilized. The unnatural cold started to fade, not entirely, but enough that he could tell it was working. For a long while, neither of them spoke. Oren focused on the rhythmic rise and fall of her breathing, her faint bioluminescent veins pulsing softly against his skin. Then, she finally spoke. Your species, always this reluctant to touch. Oren let out a short, breathy laugh. Not exactly. But under normal circumstances, getting into bed with a complete stranger, especially an alien one, usually implies something more than just survival. She shifted slightly, her golden eyes meeting his. There was an intensity to her gaze, but also curiosity. What does it imply? Oren cleared his throat. Romance. Intimacy. She tilted her head, considering this. Primitive. He chuckled. Yeah, well, humans have a lot of weird rules. Her lips twitched, the closest thing to a smile he had seen from her yet. Rules are restrictive, she murmured. Survival is paramount. Oren nodded slightly, finding himself strangely drawn to her certainty. For someone who had just stumbled into his life from an entirely different world, she spoke with a confidence that felt unshakable. And yet, there was something else beneath it. A weight. A burden she hadn't shared yet. Who are you? He asked finally. The humor in her eyes flickered away, replaced by something far more guarded. She hesitated before answering. My name is Varel Aranis. She took a slow breath. And I am exiled. Oren frowned. Exiled. Varel's gaze flickered toward the window, where the blizzard still raged on outside. My people do not tolerate defiance, she said softly. To question our leaders is to be erased. Oren's breath caught in his throat. He had thought her arrival was just a bizarre accident, an alien caught in a storm, seeking warmth. But now, a new realization settled over him like an icy weight. She wasn't just lost. She was running from something. And if her people truly erased those who defied them, they were coming for her. And if Oren wasn't careful, they'd come for him, too. The cabin's old heater continued its weak protest, barely pushing back against the cold that seeped through the cracks in the windows. Despite being wrapped in the thickest blanket Oren owned, Varel Aranis still shivered against him, her body struggling to retain the warmth she had absorbed. The initial shock of finding an alien on his doorstep was starting to wear off, replaced by something far more unsettling, the knowledge that she was being hunted. Exiled. That word had been hanging in the air for several minutes now, unspoken but heavy. Oren leaned his head back against the couch, exhaling slowly. His body was stiff from maintaining a half-reluctant, half-necessary embrace with the alien woman, but at this point, he wasn't even sure if the contact was just for her survival anymore. I think you need to explain, he finally said. Varel didn't respond at first. She shifted slightly, adjusting her position against him, her golden eyes flickering in the dim cabin light. For a moment, he thought she might ignore the question entirely. Then, she spoke. My people are called the Zenda, she murmured. We are a species built on structure, control, order. Oren noted the sharpness in her tone. And that's a bad thing, he asked. Varel exhaled softly, shaking her head. At its core? No. A structured society is necessary for stability. The problem arises when structure becomes absolute. When there is no room for choice. She tilted her head back slightly, gazing toward the ceiling, as if the words she wanted to say were hovering just out of reach. I was born into a high-caste family. My genetics were desirable. Her lips curled slightly in distaste. Among the Zenda, certain exceptional traits are valued above all else. Strength, intelligence, tactical prowess. Oren frowned. They breed people for specific roles. She nodded once. From the moment we are born, our futures are set in stone. We are trained for the roles we are assigned, and we do not question them. He felt a strange discomfort settle in his gut. It was one thing to read about dystopian regimes in fiction, governments that dictated people's lives down to the smallest details. It was another thing entirely to hear someone speak about it as their reality. And what was your role? He asked quietly. Varel's jaw tightened. I was a strategic combat advisor. A position of honor, meant for those who excel in both warfare and governance. She turned slightly, meeting his gaze. I earned that title. Through combat, through training, through endless simulations. Every part of me was built for it. Oren could believe it. Even now, exhausted, weakened, her body still recovering, she radiated the presence of a warrior. Her movements were precise, deliberate. Her golden eyes missed nothing. So what went wrong? He pressed. Varel exhaled slowly. I refused my final obligation. Oren waited, sensing the weight of whatever she was about to say next. My position required more than just tactical expertise, she continued, her voice steady but laced with underlying frustration. To unify factions within the Zenda military, my union with a high-ranking officer was deemed strategically necessary. Oren felt his stomach tighten. You mean an arranged marriage? Varel's golden eyes darkened. Not arranged. Mandated. A cold silence settled between them. Oren wasn't sure what to say. He had heard of forced alliances before, both in human history and fiction, but to see someone actually fleeing their entire species to escape one was unsettling. And if you refused? He asked. Varel's expression was unreadable. I did refuse. She clenched her jaw. I stated my opposition to the council. They gave me two choices, comply or be reclassified. The way she said the word made his skin crawl. Reclassified? He echoed. She hesitated, her fingers tightening slightly on the fabric of the blanket. The Zenda do not tolerate defiance, she said carefully. There is no need for a leader who questions. No need for a warrior who refuses their duty. Her gaze flickered toward the frost-covered window, her voice dropping to something almost haunted. To them, I was already dead. Oren inhaled sharply, realization crashing over him. Exiled. That wasn't a punishment. It was a death sentence. She was meant to die alone, discarded by her people. The fact that she had made it this far was nothing short of a miracle. And now she was here, hiding in his cabin. And they sent someone after you, Oren said, his voice quieter now. Varel's gaze sharpened. They always do. Oren stood and started pacing. This was too much. Way too much. He had planned to spend his week fixing bugs in corporate security software, drinking coffee, and watching old sci-fi shows, not harboring an alien fugitive from a species that sounded like an intergalactic dictatorship. Okay, he muttered, running a hand through his hair. All right. So let me get this straight. Your people basically threw you out, left you for dead, and now they're going to send assassins to make sure you stay dead. Varel didn't blink. Correct. He stopped pacing, exhaling sharply. Great. Just great. He turned back to her, arms crossed. And what exactly are you planning to do about that? Varel was silent for a long moment. Then, she slowly pushed the blanket off her shoulders. The warmth had done its job. She was recovering. Oren saw it in the way she sat up straighter, the way the sharpness returned to her gaze. "I survive," she said simply. There was no hesitation in her voice. No doubt. Just cold, calculated determination. "And how long do you plan on surviving here?" he pressed, gesturing around them. "You realize this is a tiny cabin in the middle of nowhere, right? It's not exactly a fortress." Varel's lips twitched slightly. "I have noticed." Oren sighed. She wasn't getting it. "This isn't a long-term solution," he said. "If your people are looking for you, then it's only a matter of time before they show up. And I don't know if you've noticed, but I'm just an IT security consultant. I don't exactly keep plasma rifles lying around." Varel tilted her head slightly. "You fear them?" Oren scoffed. Yeah. A little." She studied him for a moment, then leaned forward slightly. "They underestimate you," she said. Oren blinked. "What?" "The Zenda do not see unarmed species as threats," she explained. "They will not expect resistance from a lone human." Oren raised an eyebrow. "Right. Because I'm just some primitive civilian to them." Varel's expression was unreadable. For now. The implication lingered in the air. Oren wasn't sure if she meant it as reassurance or a warning. But either way, he had the sinking feeling that his life had just gotten a lot more complicated. Hours passed. The storm had finally begun to weaken, leaving behind a thick blanket of snow that stretched as far as the eye could see. The world outside was eerily silent. Varel sat across from Oren now, wrapped in the oversized thermal blanket, her golden eyes scanning the room with sharp calculation. "You regret helping me," she observed. Oren hesitated, then shook his head. "I don't regret it." A flicker of something, surprise, passed across her face. "I just don't know what happens next," he admitted. Varel exhaled slowly, her gaze flickering toward the window. "Neither do I." They sat in silence for a long time, and somewhere, beyond the storm, something was coming for them both. The storm had lessened, but the cold still clung to the cabin like an unwelcome guest. The heater groaned under the strain of keeping the space livable, its warmth inadequate compared to the tension building in the room. Varel sat cross-legged on the floor, her golden eyes fixed on the frost-covered window, her expression unreadable. Oren was still trying to process everything. He had spent the last few hours learning about a species so far beyond human understanding that it felt surreal. The Zenda weren't just some isolated alien race. They were an empire. A highly advanced, highly structured society that didn't tolerate disobedience. And Varel? She wasn't just some random exile. She was supposed to be erased. He paced the small space between the couch and the kitchen counter, arms crossed, trying to ignore the gnawing unease creeping up his spine. "So," he said finally, breaking the silence, "if they're looking for you, how long before they find you?" Varel didn't look away from the window. "That depends on." She turned her head slightly, her silver-threaded hair catching the dim light. "How well they prepared for my escape." Oren stopped pacing. "You mean you don't know?" Varel exhaled, finally standing. "I know they will come. I just don't know how soon." She turned toward him, arms crossed, mirroring his stance. "The Zenda do not tolerate loose ends. They are efficient, methodical, and relentless." Oren rubbed his temples. "And yet you still came here. To Earth." Varel's lips curled slightly. "Earth is an outlier. Your species is not advanced enough to be considered a threat, yet not primitive enough to be ignored. It makes for the perfect hiding place." Oren let out a humorless chuckle. "Great. So we're the galactic equivalent of an abandoned warehouse." She tilted her head slightly, considering his words. "In a way, yes." That didn't make him feel any better. "Okay," he said, trying to focus. "So if they're looking for you, what exactly are they sending?" Varel's expression darkened. "Hunters." The way she said it sent a chill through him, colder than the storm outside. "Define hunters," Oren said carefully. Varel's eyes flickered toward the window again. "They are not assassins in the way you might think. The Zenda do not send single operatives to eliminate exiles. They send retrieval squads. He frowned. Why retrieval? To make an example. Her voice was quiet now, almost distant. To show others what happens when you defy the council. Oren felt his stomach tighten. And what happens? Varel hesitated, but only for a moment. They are stripped of identity, of thought, of will. Their minds are overwritten, their bodies repurposed for servitude. They cease to exist as individuals. A cold silence settled between them. Oren swallowed hard. You mean? They turn them into something else, Varel confirmed. Living tools. Silent enforcers. A warning. Oren stared at her, horror creeping into his expression. This wasn't just about her survival. If they found her, they wouldn't just kill her. They would erase her. The storm had begun to settle, but the silence that followed was worse than the howling winds. Then came the sound. A distant, rhythmic hum. Varel tensed instantly. Oren's heart pounded. What is that? She didn't answer. Instead, she moved with sudden urgency, stepping toward the window, her movements controlled but sharp with tension. Oren followed, his breath hitching as he saw it. Lights in the distance. Not headlights. Not a car. Something hovering, just beyond the tree line. Varel's voice was barely above a whisper. They found me. Oren's mind raced. That was fast, he muttered. Varel clenched her jaw. I told you. The Zender do not tolerate loose ends. The hum grew louder. The lights edged closer. Oren turned sharply toward her. What do we do? Varel's eyes flickered to his, sharp and calculating. We run. That wasn't what Oren wanted to hear. Run where? He demanded. This is the middle of nowhere. She was already moving, grabbing what little she had. His old hoodie, the sweatpants she had complained about, the thick winter coat she barely tolerated. There's a vehicle outside, she said, nodding toward the snow-covered truck sitting just outside the cabin. Oren blinked. You mean my truck? The one half buried in snow. Varel's eyes narrowed. It functions, does it not? He hesitated. Technically, yes, but... Another sound cut him off. A sharp metallic impact against the cabin. Varel moved before Oren could react. She grabbed him by the wrist and pulled him down just as the window shattered. Oren hit the floor with a grunt. Glass rained over them. The hum was deafening now, the rhythmic pulsing sending vibrations through the wooden floorboards. Varel was already pushing herself up. We need to move. Now. Oren didn't argue. Scrambling to his feet, he rushed toward the door. Something moved outside. A shadow in the snow, just beyond the broken window. Not human. Not remotely human. Tall. Broad-shouldered. Its silhouette flickered in and out of view, as if light itself struggled to decide whether to acknowledge its existence. A hunter. Oren barely had time to register the movement before Varel grabbed his arm again. Go, she ordered. They burst through the front door just as another impact shook the cabin behind them. Oren waded through the snow, breath coming in sharp gasps. His truck, his only escape, was nearly invisible beneath the thick layer of white, but it wasn't impossible to reach. Varel moved like a predator despite the cold, her footing impossibly steady for someone not accustomed to snow. She reached the truck first, yanking the driver's side door open. Oren threw himself in after her, fumbling with the keys. Come on, come on. The truck groaned as the ignition stuttered. Oren's pulse skyrocketed. Then, the engine roared to life. Varel barely waited for him to process it before she slammed her foot on the gas. The truck lurched forward, plowing through the thick snow, skidding slightly as it found traction. Oren twisted in his seat, looking behind them. The shadowed figure stepped forward, its form fully visible now. It was tall, easily 7 feet, encased in a dark, reflective armor that pulsed with dim blue lights. Its head was featureless, save for 2 slitted eyes that glowed with a familiar golden hue. It raised one hand. A sleek, unnatural-looking rifle formed from liquid metal, shifting into existence as if summoned from the very air. Oren's stomach dropped. Drive, he shouted. Varel didn't need to be told twice. She slammed her foot on the accelerator, sending the truck roaring forward, fishtailing slightly before gaining control. Snow and ice sprayed behind them as they tore down the unpaved road. Oren kept his eyes on the rearview mirror. The hunter didn't pursue on foot. It didn't need to. The humming noise returned, louder now. A dark, hovering craft materialized from the storm, sleek and predatory, its thrusters igniting with an eerie blue glow. Oren clenched his jaw. This just keeps getting better. Varel's hands were steady on the wheel, but her expression was sharp with focus. They won't stop, she said. Oren exhaled through gritted teeth. I figured that much. The road ahead twisted, disappearing into the dense forest. Varel glanced at him. Then we make them stop. There was no hesitation in her voice, just determination. And as the hunter's craft closed in behind them, Oren realized something else. Varel wasn't just fighting to survive anymore. She was preparing for war. The truck's tires skidded on the icy road, struggling for traction as Varel gripped the wheel with an unnatural steadiness. Oren's hands were clenched around the dashboard, his heart pounding against his ribs. Behind them, the Zenda hunter's craft hovered in eerie silence, gliding over the snow with predatory precision. Its dark metallic body was barely distinguishable from the storm clouds above, its thrusters casting a faint blue glow over the landscape. Then, without warning, the first shot came. A streak of blue energy sizzled through the air, striking the road just behind them. The snow exploded in a burst of steam and debris. Holy! Oren barely had time to react before Varel jerked the wheel, sending the truck into a sharp skid. Hold on, she warned. Oren barely managed to grab the handle above the door before the vehicle twisted violently, narrowly avoiding another energy blast. The cabin lights inside the truck flickered as the electromagnetic pulse scrambled the electronics. They're not just trying to kill us, Oren realized, his breath sharp. They're trying to disable the truck. Varel's golden eyes flickered toward the mirror, calculating. They need me alive. Oren did not like the way she said that. The road curved sharply ahead, leading into dense forest. Tall evergreens lined the path, their branches heavy with snow. A single mistake, and they'd be buried in a frozen grave. Oren swallowed hard. Tell me you have a plan, he said. Varel's expression didn't change. I always have a plan. A third energy blast streaked past them. Oren saw it in the mirror. The hunter had leaped onto the craft. Its massive frame stood balanced on the ship's edge, weapon raised, tracking their every movement. We need to lose them before they disable the truck, Varel said. Oren glanced at the rapidly approaching forest. How do you feel about off-roading? Varel smirked. Reckless, but effective. She cut the wheel hard to the right. The truck lurched violently as it veered off the road, crashing through the tree line. Branches scraped against the windshield, snow kicking up around the tires as the vehicle plowed forward into the unknown. The hunter's craft hesitated for only a second before following. Oren's heart felt like it was going to explode. They are still on us. Not for long, Varel muttered. She yanked the emergency brake. The truck fishtailed hard, sliding sideways into a narrow crevice between two massive trees. The vehicle barely squeezed through, narrower than anything the hunter's craft could maneuver through. The enemy ship pulled back sharply, trying to find a way around. Varel didn't waste the opportunity. She slammed the accelerator again, pushing the truck forward. The terrain was rough and uneven, the tires struggling to grip the frozen ground, but she kept them moving. Oren stole a glance back. The hunter's craft was still searching for a way through the trees. For the first time, they had a lead. Varel exhaled sharply, steadying the truck. Oren slumped against the seat, his pulse still racing. Okay, I take it back. That was a solid plan. Varel allowed herself a small smile. I told you. But Oren wasn't celebrating yet. They're not giving up. They'll just track us another way. Varel nodded grimly. Yes, but they will have to do it on foot now. And that was something even a hunter couldn't do easily in this terrain. For now, they had bought time. The truck finally came to a stop deep in the forest, its engine ticking in protest. Varel shut it off, scanning their surroundings with sharp, analytical eyes. "We'll need to keep moving on foot." Oren stared at her. "Through the snow." She gave him a look. "You'd rather wait for them to find us." Point taken. Oren grabbed what little gear they had, stuffing his emergency pack with supplies. A flashlight, a hunting knife, a spare battery pack for his phone. Not that it would do them much good if the Zender were jamming signals. Varel checked their surroundings. She closed her eyes for a moment, as if listening. "They'll be cautious now," she murmured. "Hunters do not act without certainty." "That's comforting," Oren muttered. "So what's the plan? Just keep walking until we freeze." Varel turned toward him, her expression calm but resolute. "We find a way off this planet." Oren's brain stalled. "Wait. What?" Varel's gaze didn't waver. "You cannot stay here, Oren. Not anymore." A heavy silence settled between them. Oren felt a sudden, overwhelming weight press against his chest. "You're serious," he said quietly. Varel nodded. "If they know you helped me, they will come for you as well." Oren exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. This wasn't how his life was supposed to go. He was supposed to be fixing software bugs, not running from an intergalactic empire. He looked at Varel. This woman, this alien, who had been a complete stranger a day ago, was now the reason his entire world had shifted. And now she was offering him a choice. Run. Or stay, and risk being erased along with her. Oren inhaled sharply, staring at the dark sky above. Then he nodded. "All right," he said. "I'm in." Varel's lips curved slightly, the closest thing to a genuine smile he had seen from her. "Then we move," she said. And together, they disappeared into the night. It took 2 days of navigating the frozen wilderness before they found it. Oren didn't know what he had expected, but the wreckage of Varel's crashed ship was both larger and smaller than he imagined. Large enough to be clearly alien, but not some massive vessel. It was sleek, designed for speed rather than combat. Half buried in the snow, its dark surface still shimmered faintly in the moonlight. Varel approached it cautiously, running her fingers along the outer hull. "It's damaged, but not beyond repair." Oren folded his arms. "You can fix this." Varel shot him a look. "I wouldn't have led us here if I couldn't." Oren nodded, rubbing his hands together against the cold. "All right. What do you need?" Varel's golden eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. "Time," she said. "And a distraction." Oren didn't like the way that sounded. "What kind of distraction?" She turned toward him, her expression unreadable. "You're good with computers," she said. He blinked. "Yeah, but I don't think coding is going to help against." "I need you to access their tracking relay," she interrupted. "Scramble their signals. Make them look in the wrong direction while I finish repairs." Oren hesitated. This was insane. But so was everything that had happened in the last 48 hours. "All right," he muttered. "Show me what I'm working with." Varel led him into the wreckage. Inside, the ship was sleek and minimalist, built for function rather than luxury. But the tech inside? It was light years ahead of anything he had ever seen. Oren's fingers twitched. He was terrified. But for the first time in his life, he was also excited. The hunter's craft arrived at the wreckage too late. By the time it landed, the tracking signals had been completely scrambled, leading them miles in the wrong direction. The ship's engines roared to life, shaking off the last of the ice as it ascended. Inside, Oren gripped the seat tightly, heart pounding as they broke through Earth's atmosphere. Varel sat at the controls, focused, determined. Their old lives were gone, their futures uncertain. But one thing was clear. They had escaped. And now, they were going to fight back. The hunter's craft hovered ominously above the wreckage of Varel's ship, its sleek, predatory design a stark contrast against the frozen wasteland. The dark metal gleamed under the pale moonlight, its thrusters kicking up swirls of snow as it descended. Oren gritted his teeth. They were out of time. Varel's fingers danced across the alien console, her golden eyes scanning the holographic readouts with intense focus. The ship's systems were still struggling to recover from the crash, but the engines were humming now, almost ready. "We need 1 more minute," she muttered. Oren stared at the approaching hunter and clenched his jaw. "We don't have a minute." The hunter leapt from the craft, landing in the snow with a force that sent cracks spiderwebbing through the ice beneath its feet. 7 feet tall, encased in dark armor that shifted like liquid metal, adjusting to its surroundings. Its glowing golden eyes locked onto them with an eerie stillness. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. Varel stiffened. "Oren, get to the weapons console." He spun around and scanned the ship's control panel. The alien interface was still largely unreadable to him, but he recognized some universal elements: targeting systems, energy readouts, pulse defenses. Oren's fingers hovered over the screen. "Varel, I don't even know what half this stuff does. Figure it out. Now." Outside, the hunter moved with terrifying speed. 1 second it was standing still. The next, it was sprinting toward them. Oren's breath caught in his throat. "Varel!" A sonic blast erupted from the hunter's wrist-mounted weapon. The force of the impact slammed into the ship's hull, sending a violent tremor through the entire vessel. Metal groaned. Warning lights flashed across the console. "Shields are down," Varel growled. Oren didn't think. He acted. His hands flew across the control panel, tapping into the ship's limited defensive systems. The targeting readout came online. He locked onto the hunter and activated the pulse disruptor. The ship vibrated as a surge of energy exploded outward, rippling through the air like a shockwave. The hunter staggered, its armor flickering erratically as the pulse scrambled its internal systems. For the first time, it hesitated. Oren felt a surge of hope. It worked. Then, the hunter adapted. Its armor shifted again, the flickering stabilizing as it recalibrated to resist the pulse. Oren's stomach dropped. "Varel, we have a problem." Varel cursed in Zendari, a phrase Oren was sure meant something between "damn it" and "we're dead." She turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Oren." His chest tightened. "What?" She hesitated. Just for a second. Then she grabbed his wrist and shoved something into his hand. A small metallic device, humming faintly with stored energy. Oren's gut twisted. "What is this?" Varel didn't answer. She just pressed a hand against his chest. "You need to go." Oren's eyes widened. "Wait, what?" The hunter recovered and charged again. Varel moved before Oren could stop her. She sprinted out of the ship, meeting the hunter head-on. A blur of motion. The impact was explosive, Varel's enhanced strength meeting the hunter's brute force. Snow and ice erupted around them as they clashed. Oren's breath caught in his throat. She was buying him time. His fingers clenched around the device she had given him. "Varel," he whispered. She didn't look back. The hunter struck fast and hard, a blade forming from its wrist, liquid metal solidifying into a razor-sharp edge. Varel barely dodged in time. The blade sliced across her side, dark blue blood splattering against the snow. Oren's heart pounded painfully in his chest. He couldn't just leave her. But then his gaze fell on the device in his hand. Varel hadn't given it to him as a goodbye. She had given it to him because she had a plan. Oren took a shaky breath and looked back at the console. The ship's main thrusters were online. He didn't have Varel's strength or combat skills. But he had one advantage. He knew how to hack a system. Oren's hands flew across the interface, overriding the ship's security protocols. Then, he activated the ship's gravity distortion drive. The device in his hand synced instantly, linking to the ship's core. A targeting lock snapped onto the hunter. Oren clenched his jaw. "Got you." He slammed his thumb down on the device's activation switch. A distortion field erupted around the hunter, the air bending and twisting as the alien technology folded space around it. The hunter froze mid-strike, its body suddenly suspended in a stasis bubble. Varel staggered back, blood staining her side. She turned toward Oren, eyes wide with shock. Oren grinned breathlessly. "Told you I was good with computers." Varel didn't waste the moment. She lunged back into the ship. Oren punched the launch sequence. The ship roared to life, the thrusters igniting in a blinding burst of light. As they lifted off, Oren looked down. The hunter was still frozen in the stasis field, locked in place, unable to move. They had done it. They had escaped. Oren exhaled, slumping against the seat as the ship broke through the atmosphere. For a long moment, there was silence. Then Varel turned to him, her golden eyes filled with something new. Something close to admiration. "You improvised well," she said. Oren let out a breathless laugh. "Yeah, well, that was the single most terrifying thing I've ever done." Varel smirked. "You'll get used to it." Oren raised an eyebrow. "Will I?" Varel's expression turned serious. "We are not safe yet," she said. "The Zender do not stop. They will come for us again." Oren looked out the window, at the vastness of space stretching before them. He knew she was right. His old life, his quiet, isolated existence, was over. But when he looked at Varel, at the warrior who had defied an empire, he realized something else. He didn't want to go back. Oren leaned back in his seat, exhaling. "So, where to next?" Varel's golden eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. "We find allies," she said. "We fight back." Oren grinned. "Sounds like a plan." As the ship jumped into hyperspace, disappearing into the void, one thing was clear. The fight was far from over. It was only just beginning.